There is a particular kind of summer morning in Nebraska when the heat arrives before you do. You step outside before breakfast, before the coffee has finished, and the air already has weight to it, a thick, golden pressure that settles on your shoulders like a hand. The grasshoppers are already working. The light comes in flat and certain across the top of the corn. I am sitting on my porch on such a morning. I am 71 years old. My hands still reach for wood out of habit. There is a piece of pine across my knee right now that I have been shaping for no particular reason for the better part of a week. My grandson Thomas is sitting on the step below me, about to leave for an apprenticeship in Omaha. He asked me this morning what the most important thing I had ever learned about building was. I did not answer right away. I turned the pine in my hands. I watched a red-tailed hawk work a slow circle above the south field, and then I set the wood down and looked at my grandson, who is 17 and certain of most things, the way a person is certain at 17 before the world has had sufficient opportunity to instruct him otherwise. "I'll tell you about a cellar I didn't build," I said, "and I'll tell you why that's the one I remember. You have to understand what Nebraska was in the winter of 1887 going into 1888. I do not mean the geography, though that matters, the flat expanse of it, the way the wind comes across the prairie without anything to slow it, the way a storm can be visible for 40 miles and still surprise you with how fast it arrives. I mean the particular texture of life in a community of maybe 200 souls spread across 12 miles of bottomland and upland and creek drainage, living close enough to need each other and far enough apart to forget that fact during the good seasons. We had German families, English families, a handful of Irish. There were 2 Norwegian brothers who ran the best grain operation in the county and spoke to almost no one. There was a postmaster named Alderton who had come from Cincinnati and never quite recovered from the shock of arriving. There was Harlan Briggs, who had been farming the same 160 acres for 12 years and considered himself, with some justification, as established a man as the county contained. And there was the Voss family, out on the east edge of what most people considered the good land, and a few people considered the marginal land, depending on the year's rainfall. Joseph Voss had come from Bohemia, that is the western part of what is now called Czechoslovakia, though in 1871, when the Vosses arrived, it was still the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the distinction meant nothing to any of us at the time because none of us knew enough to make it. He was a solid, quiet man who worked hard and asked for little, and was regarded by the community with the particular blend of mild respect and general forgetting that the community reserved for people it did not consider fully its own. He died of pneumonia in the winter of 1886. He was 46 years old. That left his wife Marta, 44, and their daughter Louise, who was 8 years old at the time of her father's death and 9 by the autumn I am about to describe. There was also a son, older, who had gone west to Oregon 2 years before his father died. He sent letters when the mail ran, which was not always. I repaired the Voss barn door in September of 1887. That is how I came to know Marta, or rather, that is how I came to stand in the same yard as Marta, while understanding almost nothing about her. I was a carpenter with 30 years of work behind me. I had built houses, barns, root cellars, fences, chicken coops, church pews, and a considerable number of objects whose purpose I had been told once and immediately forgotten. I was good at my work. I knew it. That kind of knowledge sits comfortably in a man's chest, and I will not pretend it didn't sit comfortably in mine. I fixed the barn door in about 2 hours. It was a good door. Joseph had built it well, and what had failed was the hardware, not the wood. While I worked, I was aware of Marta moving around the yard behind me, doing several things at once in the way that women on frontier homesteads are always doing several things at once. At some point, I noticed she was working at a large wooden trough near the cellar entrance, mixing something with both arms, up to her elbows, turning and pressing the mixture against the sides of the trough. I looked at it long enough to see that it was dark and dense, clay-colored, laced through with dry straw. Then I looked away and went back to the door hinge. I did not ask what she was doing. I want to be precise about why I didn't ask. It was not rudeness exactly. It was the particular incuriosity of a man who has decided, without fully deciding, that certain people's work is not worth his inquiry. Marta Voss was a Czech widow, doing something with mud in her yard. I was a carpenter, with a door to finish. The distance between those two facts felt at the time like the natural order of things. I collected my fee, she paid exactly, in coins she counted carefully from a small tin, and I drove home. That was September. The winter would arrive in January, and it would arrive in a manner that none of us who lived through it ever found adequate words to describe afterward. But I am getting ahead of myself, because the winter is not the beginning of this story. The beginning is the woman, and the woman's knowledge, and the long history of how that knowledge came to live in her hands. Marta Voss had been born in a village called Trebon in southern Bohemia in 1843. I know this because her daughter Louise told me many years after the events I am describing. Louise was 9 years old during the winter of 1888. She is 42 now, living 4 miles east of here with her husband and 3 grandchildren, and she has one of the clearest memories of anyone I have ever met. She told me things about her mother that I could not have seen, things that happened in lamplight, in Czech, in the interior spaces of a life that the community around it had never thought to enter. Marta's grandmother was a woman named Vera. She had been a farmer's wife and, before that, a farmer's daughter, and, before that, the descendant of a long line of people who had solved the problem of keeping food alive through Central European winters using nothing but the materials the earth provided and the accumulated intelligence of the women who had come before them. The structure Vera built and maintained and taught was called a pivnice. The word simply means cellar in Czech. But what Vera had built in the yard behind the house in Trebon was considerably more deliberate than that word suggests. It was a low structure, half buried, with walls of a composite material, clay mixed with dry straw in a specific proportion, that Vera maintained and repaired each autumn before the first freeze. The roof was a double layer of living sod, cut from a particular corner of the field where the grass grew dense and deep-rooted. The floor was river gravel, laid 2 inches deep, with a narrow drainage channel at the base of the north wall. The entrance was hung with 2 heavy curtains set 3 feet apart. It had kept food alive through 40 Bohemian winters without the loss of a single root vegetable bin. When Marta was 12 years old, she helped her grandmother repair the pivnice after a spring flood had damaged 2 of the walls. She mixed the clay straw composite herself under Vera's direction, failing twice before she found the proportion that passed the test Vera had taught her. Squeeze a handful tightly, then open the fist. If it holds its shape without cracking, the ratio is correct. She relaid the sod roof, learning that the second layer went down with the roots facing upward, a detail that puzzled her until Vera explained it in terms simple enough for a 12-year-old to hold. The roots drink the wet air and send it up and out so the dry grass underneath can do its work. She cut the gravel channels. She rehung the inner curtain. She stood inside the finished structure with her grandmother and felt the temperature settle, cool and dry and even, like being inside something that had decided not to be disturbed by weather. She was 12 years old, and she was standing inside an argument that she would not be able to make to anyone for another 32 years. By the autumn of 1887, Marta had been in Nebraska for 16 years. She had raised 2 children, buried a husband, watched 6 neighbors fail and leave, and 3 more arrived to try the same ground. She knew the land the way a woman knows a place she has worked with her body for a decade and a half, not romantically, not abstractly, but practically, in the specific language of drainage angles and soil composition, and which direction the killing wind came from in February. She also knew the community the way a woman knows a community that has never quite decided she belongs to it. 3 years before the winter I am describing, she had mentioned something quietly, in passing, during a conversation about cellar construction, to a neighbor named Aldous Prentice, who was building a new root cellar and was discussing the matter with anyone who would engage him. Marta had been present at this conversation. She had listened for several minutes before offering carefully that a mixture of clay and dry straw applied to the interior walls would improve the cellar's performance in a serious freeze. She had explained the principle briefly. She had used plain language. Prentice had smiled in the way that a man smiles when he has decided to be polite about something he has already dismissed. He said he appreciated the thought. He said American lumber was a different matter than whatever they used in the old country. He said his cellar would be fine. He said nothing else, but his expression said the rest, and Marta, who had been reading expressions in 2 languages since she arrived in Nebraska, read it without difficulty. She did not offer the information again. She went home that afternoon and worked in her garden until the light failed, and she did not discuss what had happened with anyone because there was no one to discuss it with. Joseph was already ill by then, though they did not yet know how ill. Louise was 6. The community was the community. She filed the incident in the same place she filed all the other incidents of that category. Not forgetting them, never forgetting them. Simply storing them with the patient accuracy of a woman who has learned that some knowledge must wait for the right conditions before it can be given. The right conditions, as it turned out, would be a January morning in 1888 when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours and kept going. But that is not where I want to start. I want to start in September when I fixed the barn door and didn't ask. I want to start there because it is the most honest place to begin. The moment that, if I had been paying a different kind of attention, might have changed how the winter went for a great many people, including myself. Marta Voss was standing in her yard, mixing clay and straw in a wooden trough, preparing to solve a problem that would kill livestock and spoil harvests and drive families off their land across 4 counties. And I picked up my toolbox and drove home without asking a single question. That is the beginning of this story. The rest of it is what happened because of that, and despite it. There is a thing that happens to a craftsman's hands after enough years of work. They begin to think independently of the rest of him. A carpenter will run his thumb along a board and know, before his mind has formed the question, whether the grain will hold a nail or split under pressure. A stonemason will lift a rock and feel through his palms which face is the true face, the one that wants to be placed downward toward the earth, where it will bear weight without complaint. I have thought about this often in the years since the winter of 1888, because what Marta Voss was doing in that wooden trough in September was a version of the same thing. She was not consulting a book. She was not measuring ingredients on a scale. She was reaching into a mixture of red Nebraska clay and dry prairie straw, and squeezing it in her fist, and her hands were telling her what her grandmother's hands had told her grandmother's hands across 2 generations and 4,000 miles of ocean and grassland, without losing a single essential piece of information in the transmission. That is what I did not understand when I drove away from her yard. That is what took me the better part of 30 years to understand properly. Louise told me that the decision to rebuild the cellar came to her mother in the last week of August, during a night when she could not sleep. This was not unusual. Marta had not slept well since Joseph died, and in the months following his death, she had developed the habit of rising in the deep middle of the night and sitting at the table with a lamp turned low, doing the kind of thinking that is not possible during the day when there is always another task pressing against the current one. She would write in her notebook, the narrow check notebook with the dark cover that Louise would keep for the rest of her life, or she would simply sit with her hands around a cup that had long since gone cold, working through whatever problem had followed her out of sleep. On this particular night in August, she had been thinking about winter. Not about winter in the abstract, not about whether it would be hard or mild, but about a specific and practical question that she had been circling for 3 years, ever since the moderate freeze of 1885 had cost her 20% of her stored potato crop, and she had stood in her cellar looking at the softened, dying vegetables and recognized the smell, recognized it from the opposite direction, from the inside of Vera's pivness in Trebon, where nothing ever smelled like that, where the air was cool and dry and even, and the vegetables went into winter firm and came out of winter firm, reduced in number as the family ate through them, but unchanged in character, as though the cold months had simply paused around them. She knew why her cellar failed. She had known for 3 years. What she had been deciding, on all the nights between then and this one, was whether to do anything about it. She wasn't afraid of the work, Louise told me. She was afraid of something else. That she would build it, and it would work, and someone would find out, and that would create a problem she didn't yet know how to solve. I asked Louise what kind of problem she meant. Louise looked at me with the patience of a woman who has explained a thing many times to people who keep asking it as though it is a puzzling question. The kind of problem, she said, where something you built gets taken from you, or gets called something else, or gets built wrong by someone who only watched the surface of it and then fails in the worst winter, and the failure gets blamed on the original. She paused. My mother had lived in this county for 16 years, she said. She understood how things traveled. But on that August night, something shifted. Marta got up from the table, took her lamp, and walked out to the cellar. It was the existing structure. Joseph had built it in their second year on the land, solid post and plank construction, a good tight roof of cut lumber, a packed earth floor. It was, by the standards of the county, a respectable cellar. It was also, by the standards of the pivness in Trebon, a structure with 4 significant deficiencies that would cause it to fail in any winter serious enough to matter. She stood in the entrance and held the lamp up and looked at the walls. They were bare plank, no insulation. In a severe freeze, the cold would conduct directly through the wood and into the air inside, and the air inside would drop until it reached the temperature of the food, and the food would begin to die. She looked at the roof. Bare lumber above, packed dirt above that. No moisture management. The insulating layer, such as it was, would absorb moisture from below and from above simultaneously, compressing under its own wet weight until it was doing almost nothing at all. She looked at the floor. Packed earth. Smooth and solid, which looked correct and was not correct, which was, in fact, one of the 2 or 3 things most likely to destroy a root cellar's contents over a long cold season, for reasons she could explain, but had learned not to try explaining to people who hadn't asked. She looked at the entrance. A single door, wooden, hung well, 1 layer between outside and inside. When you opened it in severe cold, the cold came in behind you like a dog that had been waiting at the step all day. She stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, lamp in one hand, the other hand touching the plank wall with her fingertips. Then she went back inside, sat at the table, and opened her notebook to a clean page. What she wrote that night was not a plan exactly. It was closer to a translation. She wrote in Czech. She always wrote in Czech. Her English was sufficient for daily commerce, but insufficient for thinking. And she wrote the 4 systems of Vera's pivness from memory, beginning with the walls and working outward. She wrote them as Vera had taught them, not as instructions, but as arguments, each system with its reason, each layer with its logic. She did not write apply clay and straw to the walls. She wrote, the walls must hold still air, because still air does not carry cold the way moving air does, and the straw creates the chambers that hold the air still. She wrote the roof, 2 layers, roots of the upper layer facing upward, because the roots will carry moisture up and out of the insulating layer before it can accumulate and compress and fail. She wrote the floor, river gravel 2 inches, sloped fractionally toward a gap at the base of the east wall, because the vegetables breathe and their breath is wet, and wet air in a sealed space will find the coldest surface and become water on it, and water in a root cellar is the beginning of everything lost. She wrote the entrance, 2 curtains, 3 feet between them, because cold air is heavy and falls forward when a door opens, and the second curtain catches what the first one lets through, and nothing cold can occupy 2 spaces at once. Then, in the margin beside the entry about the floor, she wrote something that Louise found when she had the notebook translated 30 years later. It was addressed to Vera directly. "The clay here is redder than yours. More iron in it, I think. But the principle is the same. You were right about the floor. You were always most right about the floor." She began in the first week of September. The first task was the clay straw composite for the walls, and the first task within that task was establishing the correct ratio, the proportion of clay to straw that would produce a mixture with the right properties when dry. Too much clay, and it would crack as it cured, leaving fissures that cold air would find and widen over the course of a winter. Too much straw, and it would be too porous, too light, too easily damaged. The finished material needed to be dense enough to resist pressure, but porous enough at the microscopic level to trap the still air that was its whole purpose. Vera's ratio had been 3 parts clay to 1 part straw, with water enough to make it workable, but not enough to make it loose. Marta began there. She mixed a test batch in the wooden trough, the one I had seen and not asked about, working it with both arms until the consistency was uniform throughout. Then she took a handful, squeezed it in her right fist with full pressure, held it for a count of 10, and opened her hand. The ball held its shape. No cracking at the edges. She pressed it with her thumb, and it gave slightly, like good bread dough without collapsing. She set it on a flat board in the sun to cure for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, she squeezed it again. A single hairline crack had opened along one edge, not a failure exactly, but an indication that the mixture had dried slightly uneven, possibly because she had applied the water in 2 additions rather than 1. She noted this in her notebook. She mixed a second batch, added the water in a single slow pour while working the mixture continuously. Let it cure, no cracks. She began on the walls. The application took 6 days. She worked with a flat board salvaged from a broken wagon panel, pressing the mixture against the plank walls in layers no thicker than her thumb at a time, letting each layer begin to firm before applying the next. She built up to 8 inches on 3 walls, 6 on the 4th, where an old shelf bracket interrupted the surface. The work was slow and physical, and left her arms aching to the shoulder by the end of each day. Louise helped where she could. She was 9 years old and not strong enough for the heavy mixing, but she carried water from the well and held the lamp in the dimmer corners and asked questions with the focused curiosity of a child who understands, without having been told, that something important is happening. "Why does it have to be that thick?" she asked on the 3rd day. "Because thin is not still," Marta said. "The cold moves through thin things. It needs distance to stop." "How much distance?" Marta pressed her palm flat against the freshly applied wall. Enough that by the time the cold reaches the inside air, it has forgotten what it was. Louise thought about this for a moment, then nodded and went back to holding the lamp. On the 5th day, the north wall developed a crack. It ran horizontally, about 18 inches from the floor, perhaps 2 feet in length. A clean separation where the material applied on the 4th day had met the material applied on the 3rd. The 2 applications had cured at different rates, and the seam between them had not bonded completely. Marta looked at it without speaking for a long time. Then she went back to the trough and mixed a thinner batch, the same ratio but with more water, the consistency of thick porridge rather than bread dough. She worked this into the crack with her fingers, pressing deeply, feathering the edges outward onto the surrounding surface so the repair would cure as part of the wall rather than as a patch on top of it. She let it cure for 3 full days before touching it again. It held. She didn't seem upset about it, Louise told me. She seemed interested, like the wall had told her something she needed to know, and she was glad to know it, even though it meant more work. That is the thing about a person who learned their craft from someone who understood it completely. They do not experience failure as defeat. They experience it as information. The crack in the north wall told Marta that her application had to be continuous, that she could not leave a day's work and return to the same surface the next morning without bridging the seam. She adjusted her method. She worked each wall from bottom to top in a single session, finishing before she stopped. The walls held after that. By the third week of September, the walls were done and curing. 8 inches of clay and straw on 3 sides of the cellar, dense and reddish-brown in the lamplight, faintly warm to the touch from the ongoing process of drying. To someone who didn't know what they were looking at, they might have appeared merely strange. A root cellar inexplicably thickened, its interior space reduced by a foot in each direction. To someone who did know what they were looking at, they were the beginning of an argument about what the earth can be made to do when you ask it correctly. But no one came to look. No one asked. September moved toward October. The hawk was still working the south field. The air still had that flat, golden quality of late summer on the plains, warm enough in the afternoon to work without a coat, cold enough by midnight to remind you that something was coming. Marta moved on to the roof, and it was on the roof, with the second thing she built, that she encountered the problem that would take her 3 days to solve, and whose solution would turn out to be, as I later told my grandson on this same porch on this same kind of summer morning, the single most important piece of thinking in the entire structure. But that is the next chapter of this. The problem with the roof presented itself on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, in the form of 3 sod panels lying on the ground that had been on the roof the evening before. Marta stood and looked at them for a moment. The morning was still, no wind to speak of, which meant the panels had not blown off. They had simply slid. She climbed up carefully and examined the surface. The first layer of sod was intact, cut panels of dense prairie grass laid flat across the lumber roof, root side down the way a person would naturally place them, the way any sensible person would assume they should go. They had settled over the first week into a reasonably tight surface. She had been satisfied with them. The second layer, which was where the problem lived, was meant to go over the first with the panels offset, like shingles, so that no 2 seams aligned and cold air could find no direct path through. She had begun laying it the previous afternoon. The 3 panels that were now on the ground were the ones she had placed last, near the eastern edge. She sat on the roof and thought about why. The first layer panels were cut to roughly the same size and weight. The second layer panels, being cut from a different section of field, were slightly lighter. The grass there grew less densely, the root structure less massive. On a flat surface, with nothing to anchor their edges, the lighter panels had simply moved in the night, shifted by their own minor unevenness until gravity found the argument it was looking for. She could cut heavier panels. That was one solution, and she considered it for perhaps 30 seconds before setting it aside. Heavier panels would be harder to work with, harder to adjust, and the fundamental problem was not the weight, but the attachment. She could pin the panels with stakes. She had seen this done on a neighbor's sod barn, wooden stakes driven through the sod into the structure below. It worked for a barn. For a cellar roof, she needed to be able to relay the panels in future years as they aged and thinned, and stakes would complicate that. She sat on the roof a while longer. Below her, through the open cellar entrance, she could smell the clay walls curing, that particular dry, mineral smell that she associated so completely with Vera's pivness that catching it unexpectedly still caused something to shift in her chest. She thought about Vera's roof. She had been 12 when she helped repair it, and she had been primarily focused on the walls that day, on learning the clay-straw mixture, on passing the squeeze test. But she had watched Vera on the roof. She had watched the way the old woman laid the second layer, and there had been something about it that she had noted at the time and filed without fully understanding. The roots. Vera had laid the second layer with the roots facing upward. Marta had not done this. She had laid both layers the same way, roots side down, because that was the natural direction. Roots toward earth, grass toward sky, the way any growing thing oriented itself. It had seemed self-evident, and she had not questioned it. But Vera had not laid it that way. She climbed down from the roof, went to the section of field where she had been cutting sod, and crouched next to a fresh-cut panel. She turned it over and looked at the root side. The roots were dense and fine, a mat of interconnected fibers still holding clots of dark soil. She thought about what roots do. Roots draw moisture upward. That is their entire purpose, to pull water from the ground and carry it up through the plant. Even separated from the ground, even dead and dried, the root structure retained that capillary tendency. Water moved through it by the same physical principle that moved water through a wick. In the pivness, the interior of the cellar was warmer than the outside air throughout the winter. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air. The air rising from inside the cellar would carry moisture upward through the roof structure. If the roots of the upper sod layer faced down, that moisture would encounter the root mat and condense within the insulating grass layer below, wetting it, compressing it, reducing its insulating value precisely as the winter deepened. But if the roots faced up, the moisture rising from inside would pass through the dry insulating layer and encounter the root mat at the top. And the roots, even dead, would wick it further upward and release it into the open air above the roof, away from the structure entirely. The insulating layer stayed dry. A dry insulating layer holds its loft, its thickness, its capacity to trap still air. It does not compress. It does not conduct cold. It remains, throughout the worst of February, essentially what it was in October. Marta sat back on her heels and looked at the field for a long moment. She told me later, Louise said, that she felt something she didn't have a word for in either language. Not pride, not excitement. Something quieter than both of those. Like when you have been carrying a question for a long time, and the answer turns out to have been in your hands the whole time, and all you had to do was turn it over. She relayed the second layer over the next 2 days, working from west to east. Each panel placed root side up and offset from the panel below. Where the edges wanted to shift, she cut each panel a thumb's width wider than needed and overlapped them slightly, so that the weight of each panel held the edge of the one before it. The roof did not move again. She checked it each morning for a week. The panels settled slightly as they dried and compressed, which she had expected, and she added a thin third layer of loose, dry grass over the top, not sod, just cut prairie grass from the edge of the near field, to fill the gaps that settling opened. By the end of the second week of October, the roof was 14 inches of layered insulation, the middle dry as tinder, the top layer releasing whatever moisture the structure caught before it could do any damage. She stood back and looked at it from 20 feet away. From that distance it looked like a low rise in the ground, almost natural, the kind of subtle feature the prairie occasionally produced for no apparent reason. In another few weeks, the autumn rains would dull the cut grass to the same color as everything around it, and it would look like nothing at all. She went down into the cellar and looked at the walls, which were fully cured now, dense and slightly rough to the touch, a deep reddish brown. She looked at the packed earth floor, which was the last major problem, and which she had been putting off without quite admitting it to herself, because it required materials she did not have on the property. The gravel came from Briggs's Creek. Harlan Briggs ran cattle on the land adjacent to the east, and his property included a quarter-mile of creek bank, where the water had been sorting and depositing streamstone for long enough that the bed was composed almost entirely of smooth, rounded gravel in the size range between a walnut and a hickory nut. Exactly what Marta needed. She walked to his property on a Wednesday morning and knocked on his door. She explained in careful English that she needed to take some of his creek stone, not a great quantity. She would haul it herself. She would not disturb the bank or the water. Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man confronted by a request he cannot find any sensible reason to refuse, but which puzzles him at a level he cannot quite locate. "What do you want creek stone for?" he asked. "For my cellar floor," Marta said. Briggs looked at her for another moment, then shrugged and said to help herself. He did not ask why she wanted creek stone on a cellar floor. I know he did not ask because he told me so himself much later in the kind of tone a man uses when he is acknowledging a specific and personal failure. "It didn't occur to me to ask," he said. "A woman putting gravel in her cellar floor. I thought it was just, I don't know what I thought. Foreign. One of those things." Marta made 9 trips over 3 days, carrying a loaded canvas sack each time, the weight of it pulling at her shoulders in a way that she felt for a week afterward in the mornings when she first got up. Louise came on the last 2 trips and carried a smaller sack of her own. They spread the gravel across the cellar floor 2 inches deep, raked even with a board. Marta had cut a narrow gap at the base of the east wall before the gravel went in, a finger-width opening between the bottom of the wall, composite, and the original lumber, filled loosely with small stones that would allow liquid to pass downward and outward while resisting the movement of air. The gap exited through the earth on the downhill side of the cellar, where the ground sloped away naturally toward the field. The floor looked strange if you were accustomed to the packed earth floors of every other root cellar in the county. Loose stone, movable, not the solid, firm surface that felt like security when you stepped on it. 2 of the potatoes she had placed on the lowest shelf rolled off when she disturbed the air coming in the entrance, and she had to place them back. But the floor was not for walking on. The floor was for breathing. "My mother explained it to me that evening," Louise said. "She told me that the vegetables breathe. I didn't know that. I was 9 years old, and I didn't know that vegetables kept breathing after they were pulled from the ground. She said they breathe slowly, but they breathe, and their breath is wet, and if the wet air had nowhere to go, it would find the coldest surface in the cellar and become water on it. And then that water would find the vegetables, and then the vegetables would find their way back to the earth faster than she intended. She said the gravel lets the wet air fall. It falls through the stones and drains out through the gap in the wall and goes back to the ground where it belongs. She said a cellar with a gravel floor is a cellar that keeps its air dry, and a cellar that keeps its air dry keeps its food alive. I understood about half of it, Louise said, but I remembered all of it. The double entry she built in the last week of October, working quickly now because the mornings had developed a new quality, a stillness and a clarity that she recognized as the stillness and clarity that precedes serious cold, the way a room goes quiet before someone in it says something that will change things. She hung the outer curtain first. Cowhide she had been softening since July, thick and heavy, cut to overlap the entrance frame by 4 inches on each side and 8 inches at the bottom, where the cold air would want to enter lowest and fastest. She attached it at the top with a length of iron rod Joseph had kept in the barn, the hide folded over the rod and sewn in place with heavy thread. The inner curtain was burlap, 4 layers of it, quilted together around a filling of dry grass that she had compressed and stitched into sections so it would not shift and bunch. It hung 3 feet inside the outer curtain on a second rod. Between the 2 curtains was a space large enough to stand in, large enough to set down a load before proceeding inside, large enough to allow the outer curtain to fall closed completely before the inner one was opened. She stood in the space between the curtains on the morning she finished and conducted a simple test. She opened the outer curtain and let the October morning in for a count of 15, then let it fall closed. She stood in the between space and felt the air. It was cooler than the cellar interior, but not cold. The cold that had entered with the open outer curtain had dispersed into the between space rather than driving forward into the main structure. Then she opened the inner curtain and stepped inside. The cellar air was unchanged. The structure was complete by the 1st of November. She had used no materials she had not obtained herself, paid for herself, or negotiated for herself with the mild difficulty of a woman conducting commerce in a language she had not been born to. She had spent $11 over the course of the work, 3 for the extra lumber she had needed to brace the original roof structure before the sod went on, 4 for thread and additional burlap, 4 for a replacement mixing board when the original split during the wall work. She had spent approximately 60 hours of labor over 7 weeks, not counting the 9 trips to Briggs's Creek. She placed the first load of vegetables on the 3rd of November. Potatoes on the lower shelves. They kept best at the coolest temperatures, and the lower shelves, close to the gravel floor, ran slightly cooler than the upper ones. Turnips above them. Carrots in a bin of dry sand on the highest shelf. A crock of lard sealed with cloth. 3 strings of dried beans hanging from a hook Joseph had driven into the ceiling beam in their first year on the land. She took the temperature with the only instrument she had, her hands. The air against her palms felt like the air in a good spring house or like the shade on the north side of a stone building in June, cool without being cold, steady. She went back up into the November light and stood for a moment. To the north, the sky had changed, not dramatically, not the sudden color shift that would come in January with the blizzard, the yellow-gray that people who survived that day described for the rest of their lives with a particular unease. This was something subtler, a tightening, a quality of distance in the air that suggested the horizon had moved farther away, as it does when the atmosphere is very dry and very cold air is still a great distance off, but already beginning to announce itself. She had seen this sky before. Not here, in Bohemia, in the winters of her childhood, in the weeks before the deep cold settled in for the long stay. She went inside and wrote in her notebook. The entry was brief. 3 sentences in Czech. The cellar is finished. The sky is beginning to say something. I think we have enough time, but only just. The blizzard of 1888 arrived on the morning of January 12th, and it arrived the way certain kinds of catastrophe arrive. Not gradually, not with sufficient warning, but all at once, as though the world had simply decided to become a different place between 1 hour and the next. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. I know this because I recorded it myself in the small notebook I kept for weather observations during those years. At 7 in the morning, I noted 21 degrees, overcast, wind from the northwest at moderate pace. At 10, I noted -19 and still falling, and by that point, the wind was no longer at any pace I had words for in my notebook. It was simply present everywhere with the particular malice of a wind that has traveled a very long way across open ground with nothing to slow it and has arrived impatient. The sky turned a color I still cannot name accurately. Yellow, some people said afterward. Yellow-gray, the color of old bone, said one woman who had a talent for that kind of description. Whatever color it was, everyone who saw it that morning remembered it for the rest of their lives and recognized it immediately the following winter and the winter after that, though it never came back with the same force. Children who had walked to school that morning could not find their way home in the afternoon. Some of them made it, some of them did not, and those losses settled into the community with the permanent quiet weight of the kind of grief that does not fully lift. I did not lose anyone from my immediate household, but I came close enough to understand what close meant. By the 3rd day, I was standing in my cellar holding a lamp and looking at my potato bins with the expression of a man who already knows what he is going to find, but is not yet ready to confirm it. The outer potatoes were wrong, not frozen solid, not yet, because the main structure of the cellar was still moderately insulated and the temperature inside had not yet reached the critical point. But the cell walls of the outermost vegetables were beginning to fail. I could see it in the surface texture, a slight translucence where there should have been opacity, a softness at the stem end. I had seen this before, in lesser winters, and I knew what it meant. It meant the cold had already won this particular argument, and the only remaining question was how much it intended to take. I went through the county in the days that followed, as the storm continued and the temperature stayed well below zero, checking on what I could check on. What I found was a variation of the same story told by different families in different degrees of severity. From the Halverson family, who had built the best cellar I had personally constructed and were losing perhaps 15%, to the Dietrich family, whose old shallow cellar had never been adequate and who were looking at the loss of nearly everything they had stored. It was on the fifth day, while walking the route between the Dietrich property and my own, that I found myself turning east instead of south. I have thought about why I turned east. I told myself I was checking on the widow. That was true as far as it went. But there was something else, some memory from September of a wooden trough and a woman with her arms in clay, something my carpenter's hands had registered and my thinking mind had not processed, surfacing now in the cold with the slow insistence of information that has been waiting for the right conditions. I turned east and walked to Marta Voss's property. The first thing I noticed was the cellar roof. Under 2 feet of blown snow it was barely visible, but the shape of it was different from what I expected. Higher, rounder, the profile of something with genuine mass beneath the white surface rather than the flat lumber roof I had built for half the county. I stood and looked at it for a moment before I knocked on the house door. Marta answered. She looked tired in the way that everyone looked tired by the 5th day of that storm, the particular exhaustion of people who have been managing fear carefully for too long. But she did not look frightened, and the distinction was significant. She looked at me standing on her step and waited. "I came to see how you were managing," I said. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen directed at me before and have thought about many times since, not unfriendly, but very clear, the expression of a woman who has been told many things over many years and has developed, as a result, considerable accuracy about what people mean when they say things. "Come in," she said, "and then I'll show you the cellar." She lit a lamp and we went down through the double entry. I noticed the 2 curtains without understanding them yet, only registering that there were 2 of them, that the cold did not follow me in the way it normally did when you opened a cellar door in severe weather. The between space held for a moment, and then the inner curtain opened, and we stepped through. The warmth was the first thing, not heat. Nothing so dramatic as heat, but warmth, the specific warmth of a temperature that has decided to remain itself and has been successful at it. I unbuttoned my coat without thinking about it, which is what a person does when they step from severe cold into a space where the air is around 50 degrees. The body understands before the mind does. I looked at the walls. They were the clay straw composite she had been mixing in the wooden trough in September, what I had seen and not asked about. 8 inches of it, reddish-brown, slightly rough under my fingertips when I touched them. Dense. I pressed with my thumb, and it gave nothing. I looked at the roof, where the lumber above was hidden behind the thick hanging ceiling of the sod construction. I looked at the floor, the gravel, which I had never seen in a cellar and did not yet understand. And then I looked at the potato bins. The potatoes were firm, not somewhat firm, not firm in the way that things are firm when they are about to stop being firm. Firm in the way that potatoes in September are firm, dense and cool and dry, skin intact, stem ends clean. I picked one up and turned it in my hands. I set it back. I stood there in that cellar for what must have been 2 full minutes without speaking. "How long have you known how to build this?" I finally asked. Marta was watching me with the patience of a woman who has waited a long time for a question that should have arrived much earlier. "Since I was 12 years old," she said. "I brought Harlan Briggs the next morning. I will not claim I did this out of pure generosity or community spirit. I did it partly because Briggs was losing food, and I thought he should see what I had seen, and partly because I am a carpenter, and a carpenter who sees a thing he does not understand needs to understand it, and understanding it required hearing Marta explain it to someone else while I listened carefully. Briggs came through the double entry and felt the warmth and looked at the potatoes and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Why doesn't every cellar work this way?" Marta looked at him. Then she began to explain in her careful, measured English the 4 systems: the walls, the roof, the floor, the entry. She explained each one not as a list of materials, but as a reason. She said, "The walls hold still air, and still air does not carry cold." She said the roof stays dry because the roots face upward and carry the moisture out before it can settle and compress. She said, "The floor breathes, and a floor that breathes keeps the air dry, and dry air keeps the food alive." She said, "The double entry stops the cold at the threshold because cold air is heavy and falls forward when a door opens, and the second curtain catches what the first one lets through." Briggs listened. His expression was the expression of a man receiving information that is reorganizing something fundamental in how he understands the world, which is an uncomfortable process at any age, and particularly uncomfortable at 52. "I told him," Marta said when he had gone, "the same thing I told Prentice 3 years ago. You remember, the man who said American lumber was different." I did not know about Prentice. She told me briefly. I sat with that information for a moment. "He didn't ask," I said, meaning myself as much as Prentice. "No," she said. "None of you asked." She said it without anger. That was the part that stayed with me, not bitterly, not as an accusation shaped like a statement, but as a plain fact, the way a carpenter states the measurement of a board. 4 more families came to the cellar in the following days, then 3 more. Clara Morrison came alone one afternoon without her husband and spent an hour with Marta going through each system with the focused attention of a woman who intends to remember what she is learning. She did not bring a notebook. She did not need one. Not all of them were gracious about it. One man stood in the entrance and said he still wasn't sure there was anything here that a better-built standard cellar couldn't accomplish, and Marta told him he was welcome to go back to his standard cellar and see how it was managing, and he left without responding, and his cellar cost him 40% of his winter stores before the freeze broke. By the time the storm ended in the 3rd week of January, the county had counted its losses. Across 9 families with standard cellars, the average loss of stored food was 31%. 3 families had lost more than half. 1 family abandoned their claim in February and went back east. Marta Voss lost nothing. The spring came late that year, as it sometimes does after a hard winter, as though the season itself needed time to recover. When the thaw finally arrived, it was tentative at first, a softening at the edges of things, the creek running freely while ice still clung to the banks, mud on the south-facing slopes, while the north-facing ground stayed frozen for another 2 weeks. I wrote up what I had seen and what Marta had explained to me. I wrote it carefully, over several evenings, and I included her name twice in the draft I submitted to the county paper. The printed version did not contain her name. I have explained elsewhere why that failure was mine. I do not intend to excuse it further. What I will say is this. When someone showed Marta the printed article, she read it slowly and folded it and handed it back. She said one thing in Czech, which Louise translated for me much later. The cellar still works. That part they got right. She left Nebraska in the spring of 1891. Her son had land in Oregon and needed her knowledge of cold climate food storage for a wet coastal winter, very different from anything he had encountered on the prairie. He wrote and asked. She packed what she could carry and went. The cellar remained. Louise stayed, married a man named Hadek, raised children and eventually grandchildren on the same ground, and used her mother's cellar for 40 years. She had the notebook translated when she was 53, and she found the margin notes addressed to Vera, and she wrote to me about them, and that is when I understood for the first time what the cellar had actually been. Not a practical structure built for a community that would not ask, but a conversation between a woman and her grandmother, conducted across death and distance and ocean and 30 years of prairie wind, through the medium of clay and straw and river gravel and the particular angle at which a sod panel should be laid so that its roots face upward. Louise also found an error in the notebook. The drainage gap in the east wall was specified at 3 inches from the floor. Louise, who had watched that cellar through 40 Nebraska winters, had corrected it to 5, 2 additional inches that kept the gap clear of sediment accumulation and extended the drainage function through the spring thaw. She teaches 5 inches now to the women who come to her, which they do quietly and regularly. She tells them her mother specified 3. She tells them why she changed it. A daughter who corrects her mother's measurement, respectfully, with evidence accumulated over a lifetime. That is not a departure from the original knowledge. That is what knowledge does when it is handled correctly. It grows, it refines itself, it earns small improvements through the slow work of attention. I am 71 years old, sitting on this porch with a piece of pine I have been shaping for no particular reason, and my grandson Thomas is looking at me the way young people look at old ones when they are not sure whether what they are hearing is wisdom or simply age expressing itself. I told him the cellar Marta Voss built is still standing, 63 years old now. Original clay straw walls, original sod roof replaced twice by the same method. Gravel floor. Double entry. It holds 52 degrees in January. I told him the most important thing I ever learned about building was not a technique. It was a habit of attention, the practice of noticing who already knows how to do what you cannot yet do, and asking them before the winter comes, not after the potatoes begin to soften, not after the sky turns the color of old bone and the temperature has already made its argument, and you are standing in your cellar holding a lamp and confirming what you already know before. Thomas sat on the step for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Did she know you were going to tell this story?" I picked up the pine piece and turned it in my hands. "I wrote to her once," I said, after I heard she had settled in Oregon. "I told her I intended to tell it correctly whenever I had occasion. She wrote back one sentence. What did she say?" I set the pine down. She said, "Tell them about the floor." Most people forget the floor. The hawk was still working the south field. The grasshoppers were still in the corn. The morning had all the warm certainty of a summer that does not yet know what is coming. I picked up the pine piece again and went back to work.